throw it over to.
All right, thanks, Christine. So, I just wanted to give a quick overview of what the integration subteam does, some of the resources we provide, and then just have some prompts to have a discussion about what integrations you all might be using and what integrations you might all want to see. So the Technical Advisory Council's integration subteam, much like some of the User Advisory Council and documentation and Technical Advisory Council documentation subteams you've heard about today, we try to be a resource for the community, create resources, put people in touch with one another, answer questions that people might have. Particularly with respect to integrations, we do the best that we can to track on current integrations that people might be working on. We don't actually develop integrations, but we try to make sure we're maintaining some community resources with lists of integrations, just knowing sort of what conversations are happening for integrating various systems with ArchivesSpace. We try to create resources that might assist members of the community with their integration work, so sort of how to get started, putting people in touch with one another, and I'm going to talk about a couple of the pages we've put together that just have some basic information for if you're thinking about beginning an integration project, sort of what you might want to think about. We try to liaise between those developing integrations, the ArchivesSpace program team, and the ArchivesSpace community. For some specific integrations, and we haven't done this in a while, but we try to help people determine scope and write specifications for what an integration ought to do. And then, most importantly, I think, actively engage with ArchivesSpace community members by answering questions from emails, listservs, other forms of communication, member forums like this. One of the resources that we make available, I've got a link here, it's all on the Technical Advisory Council's wiki, is sort of providing some basic definitions about what integrations are in the context of thinking about ArchivesSpace and integrating ArchivesSpace with other applications. So for our purposes, an integration with ArchivesSpace is a functional coupling between a space and another application to act as a coordinated whole, so to sort of do one task in a way that has seamless data flow without sort of a manual intermediary step between systems. That's sort of what a lot of the integrations with ArchivesSpace consist of, is just moving metadata that you might have in another system into ArchivesSpace or from ArchivesSpace into another system without having to export something, clean it up, import it into another system, copy and paste, anything like that, trying to facilitate that seamless data flow. There are various methods of creating and sustaining an integration with ArchivesSpace. Many of these methods we've heard about today in the context of other conversations. One is the ArchivesSpace API, makes it possible for other applications to integrate with ArchivesSpace, so to pull information out of ArchivesSpace or to get information into ArchivesSpace. An example of that is an integration between ArchivesSpace and Archivematica, where actually most of the integration work happens on the Archivematica side of things, where it communicates with the ArchivesSpace API. Some other examples are through ArchivesSpace plugins. So this is where most of the integration work is happening within ArchivesSpace through its plugin architecture. So examples might be making requests from ArchivesSpace to Aeon, or the Library of Congress Name Authority File plugin, where you can search for entities in the Library of Congress and pull those into ArchivesSpace. So those integrations happen within the ArchivesSpace application, communicating with outside applications or sources of data. And an integration could also take the form of, say, an ArchivesSpace core code modification, where it's actually changing the ArchivesSpace application to integrate with some other system or source of data. I mentioned sort of the steps, the sort of checklist that the integration subteam put together, and I think it was Maggie Hughes who put together a lot of this checklist to sort of serve as a resource for people who are thinking about integrations and the sorts of steps you might want to go through to identify, develop, and implement an integration with ArchivesSpace. First one is just identifying that need for an integration, so saying we have multiple systems that we're using to sort of complete this task. We would like for them to be integrated with one another. From there, do some community outreach, see if anyone else is working on that integration, interested in working on that integration, if anyone has any ideas for what it ought to do. Next step would be to build a case for the integration internally, so get that sort of internal support and buy-in, whether it's time or money or anything like that, and then further define your requirements. So you might want to integrate, you might say, I want to integrate ArchivesSpace with Aeon, but this would be the step where you would actually say it should do X, Y, and Z. The next step would be to actually design and develop that integration according to the specification that you've laid out. So you've sort of identified the need, come up with the actual requirements that this integration ought to fulfill, and then you actually develop it, or pay somebody to develop it, or work with developers who are developing it, and then test your integration, implement it, and then finally communicating it back to the community, announce that the integration has been completed, that it's maybe available, this is how it works. So making sure that it's being put out there in a way that would benefit sort of all members of the community to ensure that it's sort of sustainable and benefiting as many people as possible. Another thing that the integration subteam has done over the last few months is we've spent a while trying to figure out what integrations the community is interested in. We've tried to keep an eye on listservs, reaching out to people individually when we can tell that people are interested in integrations, but we really wanted to get a better handle on what the broader community was interested in integrating with ArchivesSpace to see what sort of connections we could facilitate from there. So we conducted a survey, or at least began to conduct a survey, to gather more information about the systems that ArchivesSpace users are interested in integrating with ArchivesSpace. And we have a goal of producing some public findings about what integrations the community wants, to communicate it back to all of you to say these are sort of the top integrations that people are interested in and sort of the workflows that people are interested in, sort of facilitating using integrations, and then also to identify there's an optional question for if you're interested in being paired up with others who might be interested in the same integration, to connect those people. We sent out the survey in June to quite a few different listservs, and during this next TAC term, we'll be reviewing and communicating those results. I do have some preliminary results to share today. I just sort of looked at the responses last week in preparing these slides, so I have some very preliminary results that I haven't really delved too deep into, but we've gotten, I think the total number of responses is up to 85 now since making the slides. So we've gotten a lot of responses. 70 of those responses have been from current users of ArchivesSpace, but we were also curious if there were non-users of the application who maybe were holding off on implementing ArchivesSpace altogether until an integration existed. So 12 of the non-users who responded to the survey, they're planning to adopt ArchivesSpace, and 5 of them identified themselves as non-users who are prevented from adopting due to lack of a current integration. And I have a list of sort of the top desired integrations right there. A lot of these were sort of ILSs, fulfillment systems, digital content management or digital preservation systems. There were a lot of other systems that people sort of suggested, and 1 to 10 people probably suggested these applications as desired integrations for ArchivesSpace. And we also asked everyone to sort of tell us about the workflow or use case that they were hoping to fulfill with these integrations. So I have that sort of open on my screen if anyone was curious about what any of those might be. We also asked if people were not only interested in an integration existing, but interested in helping to make it happen, working to develop the integration in any way, whether it's coming up with a specification, doing any sort of testing, writing documentation, actually doing the sort of technical work of developing the integration. And over 40% of the people who responded said yes, they were interested in helping in some way. So we've got a lot of interest in pairing people up, people to reach out to who could actually try to make some of these things happen. People identified resources that they could provide and identified sort of resources that they might need to actually participate in making one of these integrations happening, including identifying shared features and consistent workflows. That was something that a lot of people were interested in to make sure that the integrations that they're developing don't just work for them. People, of course, needed technical help, developers, money, community support. They were interested in being paired up with people who might help with testing integrations, documenting them, and also just giving their opinions on what works, what doesn't work, what would be a good idea to include. So there's a lot of community interest in integrating ArchivesSpace with other systems, and a lot of interest in actually being involved in that process. So that is sort of the jumping off point for the discussion here today, is thinking along similar lines. If there are any integrations that anyone here is currently using and would like to share them, sort of what they are, how they work, and then also just what software you would most like to see integrated with ArchivesSpace, and in particular, what needs would be filled by that integration. Yeah?
Well, we're hoping to use, to integrate Preservica right now. Our IT staff is a holdup. They won't let us do it.
Okay.
Basically, we don't have a public UI for ArchivesSpace, so it's on an internal server. And they said that the only way we could integrate with Preservica would be to move ArchivesSpace to a public-facing server.
Okay.
That it can't integrate otherwise.
So are you planning to use the public interface otherwise, or what do you use as kind of the front end to your resources?
We weren't planning to use the public face at this point. So Preservica would have been nice, since we're getting more digital records and digitizing a lot of things. We thought we could put stuff in ArchivesSpace, description, and just move it over, and we can't do that yet.
So this is because Preservica does have a synchronization with ArchivesSpace, but this sounds like sort of building it out more from what it is already, so that it would work on the staff side, not just the public side.
So we integrate with Alma, which is our circulation system. Right now, it allows us to push the mark export directly to the catalog based on the Alma identifier as the book that we record in ArchivesSpace. And we can create holdings records based off of the locations that are attached to containers that are attached to each resource. And we're integrating right now with our new repository, which is not any particular system. It's something we're building ourselves, where ArchivesSpace is the metadata management system for the repository. So it's essentially a mapping between ArchivesSpace's data model and the Elasticsearch index that the repository is built on. So that's by definition an integration that only benefits us. But one of the things that I've been wondering is if there's any sort of design considerations for integrations that could be applicable, not necessarily at an application level, but at a class of tool level, like design considerations for integration with catalog or integrations with a digital repository, just something like that, so that some of this work that we're doing could be beneficial for people who want to integrate with Island Dora or Content DF or some other thing.
Yeah, there were a lot of people who are interested in integrating with just a whole variety of different repositories for digital content. That I think that would be sort of a good idea, that making sure that maybe there's differences in all of those integrations and how it actually works in those systems, but some shared way that they can be implemented in a way that would make future integrations easier or follow some same sort of pattern.
The Alma integration that you did, because that was top on the survey,
That was top
right?
on the survey, yeah.
And it's certainly on the listserv when that topic came up. Joanna, I don't know if you participated in the Harvard group at all. How much How much work did you have to do on your end to make that happen?
I probably should have tracked that. Got it. It was, so I think I probably spent, not in one sprint, but probably like a week or two of development time, which included learning the Alma Bibs API. Alma has a bunch of different APIs. The bibliographic one is the one that matters as far as integrations go. So I had to figure that part of it out, and then figure out how to make the API calls and then write the plugin to make the API calls. And we had to extend the ArchivesSpace configuration a little bit. So we had a, we added some variables to the config.rb file with the Alma API URL and then our authentication key for it. So just figuring all that back-end stuff out.
It sounds like it might be like pretty, like other people could maybe use that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's written, one of the things that I keep needing to do but haven't yet is, it's another, like it's written for us. It's not yet written in a way that the community could kind of adopt it, although I think one or two people have forked it and are using it in their own shops maybe. But yeah, that's something I need to do is write it so that if you want to use the holdings integrations to create your own holdings records based on locations, that it's something that you can define yourself instead of having to erase ours and replace them, because all that stuff is hard-coded into the plugin right now.
Does that Alma API also allow for pulling records out of Alma? Because that was also something that people mentioned, was there's a lot of people interested in pushing MARC records from ArchivesSpace to an ILS, but then also doing bulk ingest from other systems.
Yeah, so our workflow right now is, for archival collections, is that ArchivesSpace is the system of record, so we don't currently have a reason to pull from Alma, because it's assumed that the updated metadata is in ArchivesSpace, but we do have a few cases where like there's metadata that's not in ArchivesSpace that came over from our system from before we migrated to Alma that might be useful for like having a history of where locations changing over time and things like that. But we don't have a way of doing that right now. We can do a side-by-side comparison of what the Alma record and the ArchivesSpace record look like, so you can see if the record is different and if there is more metadata in Alma than there is in ArchivesSpace, but I haven't written, that'd be a whole mapping that I haven't written yet.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, for you, so we have Preservica synced with ASpace. Right now, the functionality is pretty much ASpace is entirely front end for the most part, and I will say they talk, but they don't talk well. And we've actually had like, I came to my institution, Seton Hall, like after this was set up, but there's actually a discussion group between like a bunch of other repositories, just like dealing with all the shenanigans that, because there's like little coding differences where you have to do a lot of like little back-end fixes with the sync of ASpace and Preservica. So from what I understand, Preservica is making a lot of updates. They're currently in like a massive update right now, so I guess follow that, and then you can probably report back to IT and be like, oh look, Preservica's getting its act together or something.
Yes, they are. I would have gone to the Preservica thing today if I wasn't here.
We hadn't crossed
Because
over.
they have a massive update to their PUI. They put a whole lot of work into it. I don't know, question?
Yep.
When I was at Nagara a couple of weeks ago, I talked to someone from a medical library in Virginia who uses Bagot to input his minimal information, for like collections, basic MARC record type information. He puts it in Bagot, runs it through an API, and then puts it in ArchivesSpace. And he wrote all that himself. Has anyone else done that? Or is that just totally local to you know.
There was one person who responded to the survey that said they would like to see integration with Baggett, but it looks like in the workflow and use case, they submitted a couple of different systems and didn't specifically talk about that. So at least nobody who responded to the survey did, but I don't know.
Sounds like the group would be interested. The
Yeah.
integration sub-team would
Yeah.
like to know how
Yeah.
that person did that.
Yeah.
He gave me his contact
Okay,
information,
yeah.
and he said he's willing to share, so who should I email that to?
You can send it to me, and I can get you my contact info, and yeah.
Now, the Bentley, of course, is using the Archivematica
Yes.
integration.
Yeah, we, a couple of years ago, we worked with Artifactual Systems, the developers of Archivematica, to develop a appraisal tab in Archivematica that lets you pull up a resource record in ArchivesSpace and drag and drop content from within Archivematica, so born digital content onto archival description, and then deposit it to DSpace. So in that one, all of the integration work is happening sort of in the Archivematica side of things, but it does allow us to sort of read and create metadata within ArchivesSpace to assist in processing born digital content. So it's not quite the same as like sending metadata from one system to another or using it in like a public access system, but it does just help to make our workflow for processing that content a little bit more streamlined.
Yeah, I was wondering if
Yeah.
Atlas folks wanted to talk about the Aon one.
Oh,
Maybe you don't, but maybe you want to talk about a different
I
integration.
just was curious about YouTube was on that list.
Yeah.
What that was about.
So the YouTube suggestion was about someone suggesting they would like to see live URLs in ArchivesSpace that point to their digital assets in Content DM and YouTube. And so I think just more sort of making it more obvious or more direct links from digital objects in ArchivesSpace. So I think it's more just that they want ArchivesSpace to more obviously or better link or integrate their sort of digital asset management systems that they have, and they're using YouTube for some of it.
I don't know if anyone here is using DuraCloud, but I was in a presentation yesterday about that some people are using ArchivesSpace and DuraCloud together, and the same idea that the URL could be deposited, could be put into ArchivesSpace for assets that are deposited in DuraCloud. Atlas folks, do you want to talk any about the Aon one and what that does, if people are using it?
Sure. So there's two parts to it. There's one on the ArchivesSpace end, which repurposes the request button, and it allows your researchers to select something from ArchivesSpace and send it through to the Aon side, and then schedule a visit date or request duplication. And then there's one on the client side. It's an add-in, and it allows you to search the staff interface. So if you're doing your own staff requesting, or if you want to supplement something that a researcher has submitted, or just create something for the researcher on the fly, you can import that from ArchivesSpace. We've gotten a lot of feedback about it, so it's something that we're constantly improving. We're trying to get more fields to come in to give you more flexibility about where you choose your data to come from, because some people use fields differently. Valerie, if you've got anything to add from Johns Hopkins using their...
We instigated it on the staff, on the user side, and it's been like absolutely from moment one, because we were actually recent Aon adopters. We went live with it immediately, and I left soon after, but as far as I know, it was going smoothly from the user perspective.
Yeah.
We do take feedback. So two of us, if you are a current Aon user or a future Aon user, or if you're interested in those integrations, not only can we help you get that set up, but if you have feedback about how it's working or not working for you or anything, just please let us know.
We've actually looked at Aon, so where are y'all at?
Virginia Beach, Virginia. And I was at Nagara. I don't know if you stopped by our table. Yeah, you'll be
It's
good.
not. Okay, so you're in Virginia?
Yeah.
Well, we are Atlas, we're representing Atlas, the company behind Aon.
Oh, that's right. Okay, y'all are the reps. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, we have one. Oh, go ahead. I would say we have one small integration with Aon. Also, we're working on barcoding all of our collections in ArchivesSpace. We don't use ArchivesSpace as the public interface. We export EAD and use another system, but we do have a small integration with Aon. I think borrowing from some ArchivesSpace JSON parsers that a developer at Aon wrote, probably for your client-side integration. That when a request comes into Aon that is from ArchivesSpace, it checks using the ASpace API to see if it has a barcoded location and will import the location automatically. So it's a pretty small little integration that just from Aon pings ArchivesSpace to see does this information exist, and then fills in one field just to help with fulfillment and retrieval for some offsite storage stuff. So there's ways of repurposing some of the integration that you all have done for particular things, or other institutions or other applications have developed for doing something else.
The Johns Hopkins thing just reminded me, Valerie, if you know about, when Laura, our junior developer, was at Johns Hopkins, she did some work to make ArchiveIt and ArchivesSpace integrate a little bit.
Yes, so not my work, so hoping I get this right. But as I recall, the thinking was going to be, this was a script, so it probably wouldn't have met the definition of, wouldn't have met the definition of integration as you had it up, which I actually think is a fantastic thing to do, define integration. So this was a manual step.
Okay.
But it would, using the API, retrieve all of the seeds from ArchivIt and then attach it to, and this was just a work in progress, anything that had the level in ArchivesSpace set. So level is usually set to collection, or file, or fonts, or record group. She put in a custom field that would be set to web archive, or web, and that was the key off of which this script would go through, see any archivable object that had that, see the title of that archivable object, compare it to the listed seeds that she got from ArchivIt, and then update periodically whether or not new crawls had happened by adding those as children of each one of those websites. And so picture, johnshopkins.edu has 7 seeds, and then a new one gets created. The idea would be that you run the script periodically, and the most recent crawl would get appended to the finding aid on an ongoing basis. But she never actually put that into production.
Yeah, there were quite a few people who submitted something like ArchiveIt as a desired integration, which is one where we also, I have an integration sort of that I've developed where it can import a seed into ArchiveIt, and that seemed like one where most of the integrations people wanted were to export data from ArchivesSpace to some other system, but there were a lot of people who wanted to pull in information from ArchiveIt to supplement their archival description in ArchivesSpace. So that's sort of a different twist on the kinds of integrations that people want, is to, rather than use ArchivesSpace as the basis for some other system to pull in information. But that is one too where I think it would be great to have the sort of those steps of getting different community members together to define what that integration would do, because I would imagine there's a lot of people for ArchiveIt who are interested in doing somewhat different things. So defining some common or shared workflow or use cases would be, I think, super helpful.
Yeah, I also have a question about
Sure.
your Aon integration.
Sure.
So when it's pulling in the locations from ArchivesSpace, is it then printing that on is that included on the call slip?
Yeah, it pulls it in and just puts it into the location field in Aon, so it just adds it to the record. So then when the call slip is printed, it's there.
Okay.
Yeah. If I can go back. Is there anybody who's using sort of any of these other systems, either here or sort of on this slide, that sort of they're thinking could be integrated with ArchivesSpace or have never really thought about it, but are curious what other people might want to do. Yeah, I think both of you.
Oh, Alma is back end and Primo's front end. So
Okay,
it's kind of
the same, okay. Yeah, I think we had sort of a pre-supplied list, and then there was like a free text field where, people could enter whatever, so.
Yeah, so why would, we have Cersei-Dynix, and we can import and export large records from ArchivesSpace, so why would I need an API?
I think most of the ones that people wanted for integrating with sort of ILSs was for it to happen sort of in an automated way, so not to have to export from one system and import to another, but that there might be some regular task that runs that might check to see if there's anything new, or just automatically send it from one system to the other without those sort of intermediary steps.
Well, then I'd like to have that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's what we did with Voyager. Super lightweight, but basically we use the OAI feed coming out of ArchivesSpace. And every night we just pull down any collection of a record that has changed, and then the script then overwrites the record in Voyager. So an archivist edits a record in ArchivesSpace, and the following morning it's in the discovery layer because it gets pushed through automatically. It just uses the OAI feed, and then we have a little bit of cleanup that the script does in between, but it's completely automated. And then I look at the logs in the morning, 16 records came over, 16 records were written. If those numbers match, I'm happy.
All right, well, I do just want to plug the survey again. I think probably in the coming weeks we'll send out a reminder about it with the link again, so you don't have to worry about writing that down, and then we'll be, as I said, during the next TAC term, sort of compiling the results and communicating them to everyone. So definitely keep an eye out for those, and if there's something in there that you're interested in working on or have some ideas or thoughts about, definitely get in touch with the integration subteam at any time, and we'll try to put you in touch with other people who are interested in sort of similar projects. I don't know if you have anything else. Yeah, I think we've covered most of them. I don't know if there are any like generic workflows or use cases that maybe aren't tied to any particular software that people have thought of that they would like to see supported. We've talked about various applications that people have integrated with or are interested in integrating with, but anything that might be made just easier in your day-to-day work by having ArchivesSpace communicate with some sorts of systems. Some suggestions that people gave that I hadn't really thought about a whole lot were integrating with things like Trello or other systems for sort of workflow management, like the processing steps, and sort of keeping that up to date, so not just migrating metadata from one system to another, but actually managing the work in ArchivesSpace using some communication with some outside systems.